speaker series, and we are focused in this series on workforce and cyber work roles in the business and in the government arena. And we're privileged tonight to have Dr. Pablo Breuer here to help us hopefully expand the superset that is considered cyber for each of you. And it's an evolving area. Most of us that have been around the cyber area for any length of time, as it grew out of the information assurance world, think of cyber in terms of the ones and zeros and protecting information resources from attack within, getting into identity stores and then spreading laterally and doing harm, and in the classic confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. If adversaries can't get in to a network to affect their malicious goals, then there are ways for them to still achieve their malicious goals without having to get into the networks themselves. Increasingly, however, there can be greater value in not even trying to get in, but instead really looking at how do stakeholders that are concerned about an issue or are wanting to believe in a government or wanting to be customers of an organization, how do they perceive that information? And if a malign actor can get into that space where the audience develops their cognition, their impression of what truth is, then that can be, in many cases, more hurtful for our organization than them getting into the network. So for decades, that has been kind of sort of the PR, crisis communications, corporate communication space. But that today and going forward often falls short and misses the more deliberate campaign events that malicious actors will engage in to accomplish their ends. So I would like you to put the parking lot a bit, what you've learned about cybersecurity so far, and think about bending a little bit that umbrella that covers cyber and begin to think about cybersecurity for what in the military we've called information operations. So without further ado, well, one more admin piece. Welcome to a range of students and faculty. So we have students from both our community college cyber programs, a partnership that Virginia Tech has with NOVA and with Germana. We have students from Virginia Tech that are in the business college with either a cyber concentration area or a cyber degree. We have cyber students from our graduate programs in Pamplin, Masters of IT students, and at least one MBA student that are interested in the area, and then a range of faculty and others that are interested in the topic. So welcome to all. I do also want to do a special welcome to retired Colonel Linda Jansen, who's joining us from the National Defense University, which of course has been following cognitive warfare for some time, and when she heard about the program, expressed an interest. So thank you, Linda, for joining us. Dr. Pablo Breuer is a career naval officer that had just an amazing career that started in traditional kinetic warfighting disciplines, but early on, Pablo saw the power of information and became what we call an information professional in the community that I was in the U.S. Navy. And as we built that community and saw information as a category of warfare in itself, that cyber was a warfighting domain, Pablo was part of that group that built the information warfare community. And when he retired, he got serious in a big way academically in this, and pursued graduate education, leading to his PhD in this field. Let me just stop there and turn it over to Pablo. Pablo, can you fill in the gaps in that bio and then kick us off?
Sure. Thanks so much for the warm welcome, and thanks for having me. So yeah, kind of was mentioned, I actually grew up as a rotten kid on bulletin board systems and joined the Navy. I got my shiny computer science degree and went off to be a ship driver, and then had the opportunity to help start up the information professional community, and then was lucky enough to get to go to the National Security Agency back before we could say that the NSA had hackers, helping to run the NSA Red Team. So doing really bad things to really good people, and was lucky enough to continue to do those things. Got to go back and get a master's degree in computer science, and I specifically looked at exploiting firmware, and got a chance to help stand up US Cyber Command. Went off early in 2004 to be the de facto CISO for coalition forces in Afghanistan, and then got to finish up my tour. The second to last tour was actually teaching in the computer science department, information sciences at the Naval Postgraduate School. So I taught exploit development and malware reverse engineering and several of the cyber courses and assembly programming. And I was about to retire, and a gentleman by the name of Hondo Gertz came and got me and said, "I'm standing up an innovation center at US Special Operations Command, and I'd like you to come join." So I got to work on all sorts of weird and wacky problems. One of the things that I was tasked to do there is once a quarter host an event that discussed a topic that would represent either an asymmetric threat or an asymmetric capability for special forces and for the nation writ large. So in 2017, I hosted one on deep fakes and misinformation, disinformation. It was a great event. I went out with all the speakers for dinner afterwards as a thank you for coming down. And we had a discussion, and two things came out of it. The first one was that nobody was really looking at the problem, and the people that were looking at the problem were really just admiring. There was no money for research in this area. The second thing that I recognized was that in 2017, disinformation was at the same point that cyber was in 2003, meaning there were several communities that were looking at this, whether it was business or legal or kinetic, and they all spoke different languages, and so things weren't progressing very far. So I think the literal quote I had was, "We need MITRE ATT&CK, which is cyber. We need that for disinformation." So I started working on something called AMIT, Adversarial Misinformation, Influence and Tactics and Techniques. In 2017, after that, with my good friend Sarah Jane Terp, we did a black hat talk on it in 2019. And then when we got to version 2, we renamed the framework DISARM, Disinformation and Analysis and Response Measures, or Risk Mitigation. I apologize.
Dr. Breuer, and my students know that I'm a big fan of frameworks, and that they're so important to really understanding a problem and then assessing the relative priorities in that spectrum of what one could do, and then picking a path and executing smartly. And one of the things that the frameworks classically do, whether it's cyber or ethics, frameworks give you a language with which you can communicate with others that are knowledgeable of the same framework space. And it strikes me that that was one of the most useful things about the ATT&CK framework, that it got the defensive cyber operations, the folks that grew up in the IT and CISAD world, together with offensive cyber operations people. And now there was this common language that they could then work together. And then the second piece, so after a common language, the second piece is the risk piece, the ability to use the frameworks to bring some measurements to the risk elements. Were both of those a part of your DISARM framework work?
Absolutely, those were both part of the disarm framework, and I was actually one of the SMEs that helped MITRE build attack, and I can give you an example of where language got in the way. So there were all sorts of people in there, but primarily there were cyber people, and then there were professionals, and we got wrapped around the axle around the word exploit. And the reason that word was difficult is for cyber operators, you exploited a computer and then you take actions on the objective. If you work in the intelligence community, you do human intelligence, exploit is what happens at the end. That's when you're getting the information. And so we had to deconflict the word exploit. And what we found with disarm was very similar. We needed a common language, a lingua franca that we could all use so that we all knew what we were talking about. So that's exactly what we wanted to do. We took a look at originally about 230 real world disinformation incidents, went through some qualitative analysis, pulled out the tactics, techniques, and procedures, developed the kill chain, and we're hoping that this will be the de facto standard language for everybody to use as they tackle disinformation. First, we did it from the attacker side, and then we went back and developed Disarm Blue, which is for every tactic and technique that people on the offense can do, what are tactics and techniques that defenders can do. And so that was very much our intent.
Excellent.
Okay, so pending any questions, I'm not going to be able to see any questions or chat while I'm presenting these, so please just unmute and speak up, or if somebody puts it in the chat, if somebody can let me know. And I'll just run through these very quickly so we can have a discussion, because that's the more important part. Okay, so how are we going to look at disinformation and what is disarm? I want to start out by showing you a small video. I'm going to only show you 2 minutes of this video, and then I'll tell you where the video came from. But this is a good example of disinformation.
Pablo, we're not hearing the soundtrack.
Okay, let me see if I can.
I think probably I need to unshare and then share screen with sound. As you share again, there is a.
I definitely need to do that. And
so while you do that, hey, to the audience, please engage if you can. You know, it's just always nicer to speak to a face. Bring your camera on. If you'd rather not, that's fine also. Pablo is amazing at being able to understand and assess and think on his feet and really engage. And so he wants us to be in engagement. I'll also be watching chat and we'll pull questions out from there as well.
Okay, let's see if this works better.
Yes.
El virus fue creado en los laboratorios de bioinformática de la empresa Pirbright Institute en 2014. Los inventores o científicos que patentaron el virus son Erika Bickerton, Sarah Keep, Paul Britton. Existe un registro en la Oficina de Patentes de Estados Unidos con el número US 1013001B2 que hace el registro de la propiedad y descubrimiento o invención del virus. En la descripción de este video está el link de esta patente y el link de la página de la empresa. Hay algunas mutaciones del virus que también han sido patentadas. Coronavirus es el mismo virus de SARS, pero con mutaciones genéticas para hacerlo más fuerte y contagioso. Ver link de segunda patente de la mutación en la descripción. Esta empresa reside en Reino Unido y su lema es prevenir y controlar enfermedades virales. Esta empresa es miembro del Consejo de Investigación de Biotecnología y Ciencias Biológicas del Reino Unido. La verdadera intención de estas empresas es generar bioterrorismo con la invención y mutaciones de virus que introducen en el ambiente y prueban en animales y humanos. La mejor manera de probar los virus es en poblaciones con alta densidad demográfica como lo están haciendo ahora en China. Más adelante, las pruebas. Estos mismos virus han sido esparcidos intencionalmente en ocasiones anteriores. En 2002 ZH, en 2004 el SARS, en 2005 la gripe aviar, en 2009 la gripe porcina, en 2014 el ébola, en 2016 el Zika, y ahora en 2020 el coronavirus. Cada uno de los virus mencionados tienen su registro en la Oficina de Patentes de los Estados Unidos. No creas todo lo que ves en las noticias. No hace falta investigar mucho, la información está ahí, al alcance de todos. Johnson & Johnson se ha manifestado para buscar una nueva vacuna contra el virus, siendo que ellos mismos lo están esparciendo, y están buscando financiamiento de los gobiernos mundiales para desarrollar esta vacuna y así para poder contrarrestarlo. Estamos hablando que somos un negocio redondo para las compañías farmacéuticas, ya que ellos crean el virus, piden financiamiento mundial para encontrar la vacuna misma que ya la tienen. Y no les importa sacrificar vidas humanas para poder llevar su riqueza más allá. Así es, una vacuna más, ha crecido un 800% las vacunas a comparación de hace 30 años. Y han aumentado el caso de autismo en un 2000%. Pero el tema de las vacunas lo dejaremos para otro video, ya que también es un tema que se debe de estudiar a fondo. Abajo el link del video completo de la conferencia donde piden recursos Johnson & Johnson. En Nueva York el 18 de octubre de 2019. Se llevó a cabo el evento 201, es un ejercicio pandémico de alto nivel organizado por el Centro Johns Hopkins para la Seguridad de la Salud en asociación con el Foro Económico Mundial y la Fundación Bill y Melinda Gates. Sí, escuchó bien, Bill Gates, el dueño de Microsoft.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. It goes on for another 3 or 4 minutes, but the short version is US and UK are responsible for releasing SARS and every other major pandemic that we've had, and that's because we're in cahoots with Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical industry, who's just creating these viruses so they can sell us the vaccines. So it's one thing if you look at it through the geopolitical lens of one country accusing another country of releasing this. Imagine for a second if you worked at Microsoft corporate communications and your company is accused of funding this, or if you work at Johnson & Johnson and you're accused of creating these bioterrorism things. And what I would humbly suggest is nobody in corporate communications is really prepared for this. I came across this video early in 2020 or late in 2019. And it was right about the time it was released in Latin and South America. It was forwarded to me by a friend who didn't realize it was disinformation. And it was right about the time that Russia was trying to sell the Sputnik vaccine to Venezuela. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not, but it's a pretty interesting piece of disinformation regardless. So very quickly, I'm just going to go over the agenda. We'll talk over some definitions. I'll give you a very brief history of information technology and disinformation. And then I'll very quickly go over how modern day disinformation works, and I'll show you the disarm framework. Disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. There's a lot of confusion over disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is fabricated or deliberately manipulated content with an intent to deceive. So it is stuff that I am either changing the content or the context of with a purpose of deceiving the audience. That's disinformation. Misinformation is what the Soviets used to call useful idiots. It is when the target audience sees disinformation, believes it's true, and now they're passing it on believing it's true. That's misinformation. And malinformation is an attempt to influence perception by leaking ostensibly true information. So when you see quote unquote government leaks that make the government look bad, or internal documents leak that make the corporation look bad, that is malinformation. So cognitive security is the application of information security or cyber principles and practices to misinformation, disinformation, and other influence operations. And this requires that we take a socio-technical lens to it. I'm going to say something a little radical, and that's that just about every cyber operation that you see, offensive cyber operation you see, has some component of cognitive operations in it or information operations in it. And the reason is that with very few exceptions, the purpose of hacking into the network is to either get ahead of the cognitive cycle of the adversary, or to leak information to make them look bad, malinformation, or it's to change the perception of reality. Either way, the end result of cyber operations is almost always the effect is on the operator at the other end of the keyboard rather than the computer system itself. So the first time I had a chance to brief this, I had the privilege of briefing Vince Cerf, who he and Al Gore created the internet. And so I started briefing this, and about 4 slides in, Vince stopped me and said, Pablo, I get it, but we've been doing disinformation since we could draw on cave walls, so why is it a problem now? So let's walk through that. First, I want to talk a little bit about international law. International law is still based largely on what's called the Westphalian model of a nation state, which came in to being at the end of World War I. And it has 3 precepts. The first one is that each nation has sovereignty over its territory and domestic affairs. Nation states should not interfere with another nation state's domestic affairs, and that each state is equal under international law, regardless of size. And one of the things that we can say is that in the past, airdropping leaflets, you definitely, if you were conducting disinformation by airdropping leaflets, you violated the physical space of another country, right? Now you can mess with the internal affairs of another country and never go into the country. You can do so via electronic means, in the past via radio and television, now via social media and the internet.
Hey, Pablo, just an aside there. As I was on the U.S. senior delegation for 3 ITU events, and ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, is the United Nations element where the telecommunications norms for the world are really addressed. For years, it had been the position of the Chinese and of the Russians that cyber boundaries, the physical boundaries of cyber, ought to define the sovereign boundaries within that information space. And the policy of the U.S. and US-aligned nations, the rest of the Western world, is that no, cyber should be a multi-stakeholder environment that really transcends boundaries as part of the human right to be able to explore and learn and freedom of speech. So this concept of the Westphalian order, it has been in the interests of the autocratic nations to try to have cyber controlled in the same way that physical boundaries are. The questions for us going forward, as we have in the last couple of years been more nationalistic, more protectionist in wanting to draw a moat around our own country. Are we abandoning that concept of the information space really should be global, that's part of what makes the Western model so successful and democracy continue to bloom? So fascinating as we think about this in terms of Westphalian.
And it's kind of interesting that we say, well, the US view was this. I can tell you that having worked cyber operations for the US government, numerous times did I have conversations with lawyers who wanted to treat exploits like they were bombing routes. So, when we fly bombers, they go, well, this country doesn't agree with what we're doing, so make sure that the bombers don't go over the airspace of country X. And the lawyers were demanding the same thing of me when I sent packets over the internet. I had to explain, it's like, that's not the way internet routing works. I can't guarantee it. But so even though we say we don't have boundaries, realistically, legally, we still want to treat it like there are physical boundaries there. Yeah. How do nation states influence each other in government? We learned this model called DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And these don't exist in vacuums, right? Certainly having the military having an aircraft carrier outside of another nation's territorial water sends a very strong message. We certainly affect other nations with economic. We either give them a break, most favored nation trade status, or we implement some sort of a financial debt for trade. But it's important to realize that informational is one of those things that historically nation states have used to affect other nations. So that brings us to what's different now. If you go back in history, the first kind of revolution in information technology is the written word. And so when we started doing this, parchment was expensive, ink was expensive, and literacy was very rare. It was really heads of states and the heads of church that could really write these messages and transmit messages. And their reach was as far as they could be carried. And when they would get to the distant end, they either had to find somebody that was literate that would read it, or maybe the town crier would read it and pronounce it out in the town square. But who could transmit was very limited, and the audience really had to rely on a trusted person to kind of tell them what the message said, to really decrypt the message. The next revolution that happens is the Gutenberg Press. And what the Gutenberg Press allows you to do is create more copies of that written word. And one of the second order effects of that is because there are more written copies of things out there, more people can see them. And because of that, literacy becomes more common. So you get this double-ended effect of there are more copies and more people can read now. And so who could actually print a book? It's still expensive. So who can print is very limited, but now you reach a broader audience. And this is the first time where technology kind of bites the hand that feeds it. So one of the big proponents of the Gutenberg Press was the Catholic Church. They funded a lot of this. A lot of you have probably heard of Gutenberg Bibles. The Catholic Church probably did not foresee that Martin Luther would mass print his 95 Theses on the press and nail them to church walls. So there you have it. You go forward from that, you go to telegraph. Telegraph allows you to transmit things over a very long distance, but it requires specialized knowledge of Morse code. And so you could go down and try to transmit the message, but the operator decide they don't want to translate it into Morse code for you, or at the distant end, they could decide that, hey, I don't want to translate it from Morse code back to the spoken language. But again, now you can get further distances, so your audience gets further. Was there a question? Somebody
Hey,
came with
Peyton.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Peyton.
So you go from telegraph. The next one that happens is radio. Radio allows you to receive a message intended for the masses by buying a commodity device. So you don't need any specialized knowledge. You don't need any sort of a license to receive the message. You just go buy this magic box at your local department store. You set it in your home and you can receive the message. Very early on, governments realized that this could be problematic. And this is when in the United States, the FCC comes out and starts limiting the power of radio transmitters that are not licensed, right? And so now, you can reach the entire town or the entire city, but really you can't go out and reach the entire city unless you're on a public radio broadcast, which means that you're licensed. And so the first example, or the best example of this one where disinformation kind of gets out, is that radio becomes kind of the center of the home. It's used for news, it's used for entertainment. And so if you tuned in late to the War of the Worlds, you didn't realize it was entertainment and you thought it was news. And so that led to no small amount of panic when people tuned in late and didn't realize that an entertainment program was not news. You go forward from that, you go to television. Television is a lot like radio, except now it can transmit video. But again, up until even the 90s, if you wanted to talk to the whole of the American public, you better be, the president of the United States that goes, hey, listen, ABC, CBS, and NBC, you're going to transmit my State of the Union or I'm going to pull your license. I, as a private citizen, couldn't go down to the television station and go, hey, I'd like to talk to the city of New York. It didn't work that way. And the famous disinformation one here is there was an April Fool's Day joke that was put on by CBS, where on the nightly news broadcast, they talked about the spaghetti harvest, and they had these nice Italian ladies harvesting spaghetti from trees. And a lot of people believed that for some number of years until the cat was let out of the proverbial bag. So again, you get an ever increasing audience, but there's a gatekeeping function on who could transmit. And now what happens with the internet, and I blame Vint Cerf for this, and he's still willing to talk to me, is that the internet was intended to give everybody a voice. The good news is it worked, and the bad news is it worked. And so now we live in a world where Katy Perry has twice the number of followers as the President of the United States and 50 times the number of followers of the Prime Minister of Britain. So she has the power of that formerly only belonged to nation states, and she has to answer to nobody. So we have democratized the ability to reach a mass audience. And so we finally closed that loop that was started by the written word, where a very small number of people could transmit to ever increasing audiences. Now an ever increasing number of people can reach mass audiences. And that's what's fundamentally different now. So very quickly, different types of modern disinformation. We'll talk very briefly about actors, channels, influencers, groups, and messages. So entities behind disinformation, obviously nation states are still doing disinformation. You have individuals doing it for jollies and for personal gain. You've got companies doing it. And what you're starting to see is a rise of DAS, disinformation as a service. So a lot of the companies in the second, third world that became proficient at sending spam emails in the past have now transferred to sending disinformation. So you want 10,000 followers, you want 50,000 retweets, it's a piece of cake, it's a couple $100. It's very easy to do.
And Pablo, that's not all on the malicious side. That market to change the image of something, companies will do that to suppress a bad news actual event, and then go in the open market with a PR firm that will specifically try to rehabilitate their reputation using these techniques as well.
Yes, and these are part of the ethical things we have to talk. I might disagree that suppressing a bad event that actually happened is actually malicious. But
no, my point isn't that it's malicious. My point is there's a market for the techniques to
absolutely
change perceptions. And if that market isn't discerning, right? If we don't develop ethics for that market of practitioners that are good at manipulating digital platforms, then we're going to get the results that the market will drive, which companies with the largest bankroll, even if they work to suppress something that consumers really have a right to know about, will suppress something that should be in the public square.
Yeah, I've never seen the Facebook papers get deleted off my Facebook account. It's not happened. So channels are really where people go to get information, to seek, share, post information, and that's where people are encouraged to go. The important part here is that there are two important parts. The first one is that there are a massive number of channels. So again, I'll use a very American-centric view. If you're an American in the 80s and you wanted to watch the news, you had three choices: ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so you would watch one of these news channels, and when you went to talk to your neighbor, you could agree or disagree on, whether something was good, bad, or otherwise, but you heard the same story. Now, because there's so many channels, most people cognitively only want to follow stories and channels that feed them information that they already believe. And so if you watch, say, Fox News and you watch CNN, you get completely disparate views of what's going on. And so there's a concept of political science of the Overton window. The Overton window is for any given topic, there's a range of things that you can say. The Overton window are those things that you can say in polite company. And that's how we have the civil discourse that we hear about in class. If you're outside the Overton window, you can't say those things in public, and so you don't have that civil discourse. The problem now is there's so many channels that there isn't one Overton window. There are multiple Overton windows and they don't overlap, and so we can't have that civil discourse. And that's very destructive for democracies.
And those norms tend to diverge, not converge, right? As those echo chambers create and evolve those new Overton norms.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other thing I'll point out is that who you want to target with your narrative, whether it's real information or disinformation, is going to dictate to some extent which channel you're going to use, right? So if I want to reach American teenagers, I'm not going to go on Facebook. That's where their parents and grandparents are, right? I'm going to go on TikTok. If I want to reach people in India, WhatsApp is probably the most popular way. If I want to reach people in Europe, Wire is the most popular way. If I want to reach hackers, it's going to be Signal. So who I want to target to some extent dictates which channel I use. Influencers, users or accounts with influence over a network, that doesn't necessarily mean the most followers. It means the most influence. And so you might have a very large influence over a small number of groups. So, for example, every so often we find out that 3 very popular celebrities are using the same fitness instructor. That fitness instructor in and of themselves doesn't have a whole lot of followers, but the fact that they're the fitness instructor for J-Lo and the Kardashians means that they have an enormous amount of reach indirectly. And so they would be considered an influencer. Social media groups are often created to spread disinformation. Often the members of a group are real, but the creators of the group are fake. And an example of that is a disproportionate number of groups for both Black Lives Matters and far right-wing groups during the 2016 election were actually started by Russian foreign nationals masquerading as Americans, but the members of those groups were Americans. The reason those groups were private was twofold. First of all, it makes it much harder to view what's going on in those groups and really scan for disinformation. The second reason is if they heard a dissenting voice, they could kick you out of the group. And so you were no longer involved, and made it much easier to radicalize that closed group. Lots of themes, usually they're very sticky and they speak to pre-existing biases. So this is just what I said. The other thing that happens is themes are repeated often. There's a cognitive concept called cognitive easing. And if you hear something over and over and over again, the first time you may go, that doesn't sound right. By the 10th or 15th time you hear it, you start to believe it. And if I ask you about it 6 months later, I go, hey, did you hear about that, alien landing at Roswell? You're going to go, yeah, I think I heard something about that. And you will have heard something about that. You won't remember that it's false. Tools, bots, if this and then that variants, personas, network analysis, and marketing tools. Remember that social media, their whole purpose is to sell you advertising, right? We learned through Cambridge Analytica, if you didn't know beforehand, that they're very good at building models of the things that might stick with you and might not stick with you based upon the things that you like and don't like and read. And so the difference between advertising and disinformation is what I'm selling you. Am I selling you a product or am I selling you a view? So social media is uniquely positioned and almost designed to spread disinformation. All of the marketing tools that are there allow you to do very rapid A/B testing, very rapid measures of effectiveness testing to really hone that message and make sure that that disinformation is sticking with your target audience.
Yeah, and just an observation, Pablo, I think I shared this with you before the audience. In Ukraine, when the Ukrainian forces retook some of the previously occupied territory that Russian forces were in, they found more than 10 bot laboratories specifically designed to amplify messaging that Russian forces wanted to come from the combat zone. And what does a bot lab look like? Well, it's rows and rows of smartphone chassis, as well as bags and bags of SIM cards, so that original video that might be doctored, might just have captured Ukrainian forces in something that might be embarrassing, can then be validated by different phones with different numbers, but all geolocated in the same area. And that botnet then creates the virality that gets the velocity of that malign message onto the platforms.
It's like you've seen these slides before, because we're going to talk about bots here in a minute.
I apologize. That took you off track.
So Here we are, bots. Next slide. So what kind of accounts do you need bots? Bots used to be relatively stupid. They were explicitly run by code and they would only follow certain accounts. And when they saw something tweeted or posted by an account, they would just amplify, right? They would retweet it, they would like it, whatever the equivalent was on that platform. That made them easy targets for social media companies to kind of take them offline and go, okay, these are inauthentic accounts. So now what you see are what are called either Android or cyborgs. And these are accounts that are sometimes run by humans, but right before an attack, it switched over to code. And so now they're much harder to detect. Parody accounts are accounts that are meant to parody a real account. They're not meant to be mistaken for the real account. So my best example about that is there were a couple of parody accounts from White House staff and official DoD Twitter account and a couple of other agencies. The underground White House staff account when President Trump was actually elected. And again, nobody really believed that they were really people inside the White House posting that, but it was a good parody account. Spoof accounts are accounts that are meant to be mistaken for the real accounts. If you've heard of the term sock puppets, that's what we're talking about. Camouflage are accounts that used to create a persona so that you can infiltrate a group in particular. Deep cover accounts are what are historically known as tradecraft. These are things that intelligence agencies would do. These things are getting harder and harder to create because you can't just hop up on social media, create an account, and instantly have 10,000 real followers. People are going to look at the account and go, "This was created last week. This isn't a real person." The last one, the most damaging one, is the account takeover. That's when a legitimate account is hacked and taken over by a maligned actor. A really good example of this, in October 2013, the Associated Press Twitter account was hacked. And they put out they tweeted a false news story that there had been a bombing at the White House and President Obama had been injured. That sent the stock market into free fall. They had to suspend trading on Wall Street to trip the circuit breakers. Imagine if you had shorted the stock market right before putting out that false tweet. You would have literally transferred trillions of dollars. So real world effects. I see that there's a chat. So Samir asked about deep fakes and AI and chat GPT. We're going to get to that, I promise. So what are the strategies? Ben Nemo came up with 4 of these. He came up with distort, distract, and dismay. To that, Sarah Jane Turp and I added divide, which is what we saw in the 2016 elections. Divide is you take a populace, you find where there are differences, and you exacerbate those differences, so you don't get that civil discourse, right? You get them not talking to each other. And I think if you look at the current state of the U.S., I'd say the Russians and Chinese have been really, really good at that. Distort is making up your own facts or adding facts so that you arrive at the intended conclusion that you want. Dismiss is a typical tactic by the Chinese, right? So whenever we accuse them of hacking in the past, they said, "No, we're not hacking. We don't do that. By the way, here's a counter accusation. We're the victims of U.S. hacking. The U.S. is responsible for most hacking." Distract is when you try to completely change the narrative. So the MH17 that was shot down by rebels using Russian missiles, the distraction tactic by the Russians was not to address the missile itself, but to ask the question about what's wrong with air traffic control that they allowed a civilian aircraft to fly over a declared combat zone.
Hey, Pablo.
Dismay, yes.
No, finish dismay and then I'll ask a question.
Sure. Dismay is ad hominem attacks. These are attacks that are so ridiculous and damaging that just by responding to them, you lend them credence. So probably the best known example is the Comet Pizza, where there was this secret sex dungeon run by Washington elites. And if you're Hillary Clinton and you respond to that, well, clearly there's enough there for you to respond to, so you can't even respond to it. But it was serious enough that somebody showed up with an AR-15 rifle to the Comet Pizza to liberate non-existent kids from a non-existing basement. So that narrative did work. There was a question?
Yeah, Pablo, my MIT students and Masters of Information Technology students this semester had a chat GPT assignment where they developed using the AI and then took it to the limits of what the ChatGPT could do, and then added the human element on top of it. But Samir asked a great question about deepfakes, and it strikes me that one of the things that deepfakes can do in each of these categories is increase the velocity and the relevance of the malign messaging. Because with a deepfake, you can distort, dismiss, distract, divide, dismay in something that is temporal, that is contemporaneous with the real world issue they're following. And boom, near immediately, there's that deep fake attack, and not something that requires 2 weeks in a studio.
Yeah, so absolutely. Let me go back and let's address ChatGPT first and deepfake second. So the deputy chair of the FTC said that AI is going to turbocharge fraud. That's not me saying it. That was the deputy chair of the FTC last week. Why? You take something like ChatGPT, it's very easy to generate massive amounts of text. And again, you can just flood all of the channels with these disinformation narratives. Usually intentionally, but we've seen cases already where the model for ChatGPT was bad, or there was a time lag in things had changed and hadn't been assimilated into the model, or flaws in the software or flaws in the model that ChatGPT uses put out bad information. And people will just believe it because, well, this AI told me. And I'll say this one time, there is no intelligence in artificial intelligence. There is no magic in the box. It is standard code running on a Turing machine, and it's based off statistics. So if the training data is wrong, if the model is wrong, you will get wrong results. And unfortunately, most people will believe it. So far we've been talking about text and static pictures. Even the video I showed you was really spoken word and static pictures. And people are falling for it, right? People are falling for disinformation. Even when I can show them very easy facts of, look, what you're believing isn't true. And it's very easy to understand how somebody can create false text and false pictures. We all know what Photoshop is. Now imagine a world where we're creating deepfake videos and deepfake voice. And now I need a PhD in computer science to explain to John and Jane Q citizen that there's a lack of randomness in Q vectors of the MPEG, and that's how I know that this thing has been faked. They're going to look at me and they're going to go, I don't know what you just said, but you're a government shill. I know what I saw and I know what I heard. So I can tell you that in the last year and a half, there have been at least 2 incidents I'm aware of where deepfake voice were used to embezzle money. One was $250,000 from a UK firm, where the CEO of a partner firm in Germany was deepfaked. And the other one was in excess of 200 million targeting a firm in the UAE. To add insult to injury, Microsoft, God love them, just released a tool this last year that can create a deepfake voice from only 3 seconds of audio. So show me a C-suite executive at a multinational corporation that doesn't have 3 seconds of audio and video somewhere on YouTube from speaking at a conference. Yeah. So yeah, good luck. We're going to have very, very serious issues.
Very scary. Hey, and Zach asked a great question about the frameworks, and we should probably, given time left, jump to the frameworks.
Yeah. Okay, let me jump to the frameworks and then we can ask the question.
You know what? I'm sorry. Do the life cycle first. I think that's important.
Okay, sure. Let me go back. So historically, what we've done with disinformation is we wait for the crisis and control, right? We wait for the attack to hit, and then we're like, oh my goodness, something happened. We need to recover and evaluate what happened and kind of respond to it. And the problem is that a whole lot of stuff happens before in preparation that we could deal with. The other problem is that by the time you discover disinformation and the fact that it's reached a mass audience, that mass audience has seen the false narrative, they've ingested the false narrative, and they've internalized it. And once they've internalized it, you have to overcome cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is that psychological property of how much effort does it take for me to convince you that something that you believe is false. People don't like to do that. Cognitive friction is kind of a lesser extent of that, of how much effort does it take you to assimilate a new belief that doesn't contradict with something you have. That's reasonably easy. Convincing somebody that what they believe in their heart and soul is false is cognitive dissonance. That's much harder. But historically, that's what we've done. We wait for crisis to happen. It takes some time for us to realize it happened, and a bunch of the audience has internalized that.
So the frameworks are going to let us move to the left and
that's right.
lower the peak.
That's exactly right. So let's get to the framework. So this is Disarm Red. Disarm Red is the framework as seen from the perspective of an attacker. And don't bother trying to read the text. Let me just explain to you what you're seeing. The purple and red blocks at the top are the phases of the operation. Purple is what happens before the attack hits. Red is what happens after the attack hits. So we call that in the military left of boom, right of boom, right? So the purple is left of boom, the red is right of boom. The blue boxes below that are what's called the kill chain. And the kill chain is just a framework or a model for the minimum number of tasks that must be successfully completed for something to happen. So in order for a cognitive attack, a disinformation attack to go off, you must complete every one of those blue boxes. And the gray boxes are the tactics, techniques, and procedures you can use to complete that box. So if I look at micro-targeting, one of the ways I can complete micro-targeting is by clickbait, or I can promote online funding, or I can pay for targeted ads on social media and Facebook. And so what you can do now is you can take a look and go, hey, listen, do I have an opportunity in the preparation and planning phases as a defender to break the kill chain and not let the adversary complete the attack? So once we developed the red framework, we developed the blue framework, which is the defensive side. But before that, what I want to show you is you can go out and get Disarm from disarm.foundation. It's free and open source, so feel free to look at it and click around. If you were to click on one of these gray boxes that you see here, what you would get is you would get a description of what is that tactic, technique, and procedure. How does that thing work? What does that really mean? You will see actors that can counter these. If it's been seen in the real world, you will see real world incidents where we've witnessed this tactic, technique, and procedure. And then we will show you counters, ways that you as a defender can counter that offensive TTP. So here is the blue framework, and it works very much the same way. The phases are the same, the kill chain is the same, but now you can see what are the TTPs that I as a defender can implement to counteract the developed people link in the kill chain that offenders have to use. And so this shows you opportunities for you to get everything underneath the purple boxes kind of left of boom before you get to crisis. And so there are definitely some preparatory steps that you can take. One of the things to kind of warn you about is the offensive tactics are all tactics that we saw in real world incidents. Because nobody was doing really left of boom defensive things, we don't have as many real world examples for these defensive tactics to be done. That's the first thing. The second warning I'll give you is we made a conscious choice to list out all of the defensive tactics that we could come up with. Now, some of these may or may not be legal where you live. So what laws are allowed, what government entities and corporations are allowed to do in Europe is very different than what they're allowed to do in the United States. But the fact that you're aware of it allows you to go back and talk with lawyers and talk with government, have that civil discourse of, is this something that we want to allow if it's not allowed? And if not, then at least we've had the discussion as a society as to, we're not going to allow this and we're going to accept the risk and we know why we're not going to do this. And this really isn't any different than MITRE ATT&CK, right? There are some cyber defenses that work great, right? Everybody knows that allow by exception is better than deny by exception, and yet we don't do that because it's too painful, and that's okay. But at least you can have the honest discussion. And it looks like I have some chats, so I'm going to go to those real quick. So Zach says, when it comes to determining true disinformation campaigns versus actual grassroots issues, is there a framework or part of the framework that addresses this? Yes. So the framework shows you the tactics, techniques, and procedures, but it is built around, and this is one of the slides I skipped, this slide. And this is what I call the pyramid of pain. If you're an attacker, you sit at the top of this pyramid and you know that you have a campaign that you want to accomplish certain things. And so you create that campaign, you create incidents that will help you reach objectives to get to the desired end state. You create narratives and behaviors that support that incident, and then you create artifacts, being posts or videos or what have you, that kind of tell that narrative, right? And so if you're the attacker sitting at the top of this, you see how everything fits together. If you're the defender, and here's what Zach was getting to, you're sitting at the bottom and you have to fight up gravity. So you see these posts and you go, is this an opinion? Is this somebody that's just misinformed and doesn't know any better? What is this? So you start to collect these artifacts and you realize that, hey, listen, there's a cognitive narrative here. Who's telling this narrative and why? What incident are they trying to lead to? And in some cases, it's just differing opinion and it's not disinformation, but that's really something that the investigators have to look at. And only after you decide it's really disinformation can you go to the disarm framework and go, okay, this is actual disinformation. I'm going to deal with this, as opposed to hey, this is an editorial and it's legitimate, legitimate free speech. So
this is very consistent with the attack framework, right? Because the attack framework, the disarm framework represent the kill chain items that have to happen. That's different than the intelligence assessment of who's going after your stuff, or in this case, who wants to generate the message and what is their intent, what is their goal. So there's an intelligence function that has to be combined with your use of the disarm framework.
Okay, so the next comment is from Mansour, and I apologize if I mangled your name there. And so the comment is, social media plays a great emotional intelligence role to spread disinformation, like dividing supports into others. Yes, it does. And I will say my second bombastic thing here, which is that the current funding model for internet services is ethically unsustainable. And what I mean by that is the way that social media works now is you, the user, don't pay for it because you give tacit approval to be served up very targeted ads. There's no requirement for social media to go, listen, if you pay me a subscription fee, we won't serve you targeted ads and we won't track what you're doing. And so if you make it illegal for them to track down to the resolution they're tracking, then they become much less effective at serving you disinformation. The problem is that current social media makes a lot of money with their current model, but it's what they're doing is they're selling your cognition. I liken it to cognitive slavery. I wish when I worked at, in the government and the intelligence community, I had the level of granularity that Facebook and Twitter and TikTok have on their users. But you're right. If we continue on the current route, it is going to be absolutely disastrous for humanity.
And Mansour, as we studied in class, right, there's the Brussels effect. In Europe, they have taken steps to begin to create obligations for the social media providers, for those digital platforms, the GDPR, the privacy regime, and some other elements are beginning to explore that space of, through regulation, can we create obligations that might decrease the profit for these digital platforms? But we should keep in mind that they've been among the most profitable industry sectors. So to increase the level of responsibility that they have to address some of these things, that absolutely, as you suggested, it fits within the realm, the range of public policy considerations that as a nation, we ought to be considering going forward.
And I'm gonna beat up on a fine educational institution here for a minute. So a lot of these come out of Silicon Valley. And a lot of the founders of these social media, the big media companies, come out of Stanford. Stanford actually teaches a course on how to make your digital product more addictive. There is not a required corresponding course on ethics. I personally find that a little troubling. So I think we need to have a better conversation about that. So what's up on the slide now is another example of a TTP. And again, you get the description up at the top. At the end, down in the middle, it shows you what are the real world incidents where we saw this. And if you click on this, it links you to the incident. And then the counters for that TTP. So you can start at the red side and see what the blue counter is, or you can start on the blue side and see what the red tactic is that you're trying to counter, and it goes back and forth. And I think,
Yeah, Pablo, we're up at the
I think
hour.
that's what I have. Yeah,
Great.
that's all I have. So I will take any questions.
Yeah, let's come off the slides and bring folks
Yeah.
up in the main board here. And
I'll just leave this up for a second so that you've got my email
great.
if anybody wants to reach out and ask questions. But
super. Eric is asking a great question about the US. Could we get to something as simple as an agreement at the federal level of GDPR? And of course, Eric, we've taken elements of GDPR, and in California has passed CCPA. There's actually a version in Virginia. But if we go down that road, we'll have 56 different versions of privacy regimes. Not a very good approach for a national market, let alone a global market. Pablo, what do you think? Could we take some baby steps? Is there the appetite right now in Washington, D.C. to begin to address some of this through regulation?
I don't think there is the appetite right now. And one of the other things that happens is that the social media companies that are dominating right now very much want regulations, but not for the reason you think. Mark Zuckerberg wants regulation. Right. Mark Zuckerberg wants to be indemnified so that he can do exactly what the law says, nothing beyond that. And so when something bad happens, he can go back to Congress and go, look, I followed your rules.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
so that would be bad regulation. Good regulation, as we've discussed in our ethics class here, would be a duty of care obligation. Would be one that would say, I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but harm that occurs from your platform, you're accountable for. That's the regulatory approach that we have in the automobile industry. And hence we see crash dummies for the automobile industry. We don't have that version of crash dummy testing before digital platforms roll out new techniques that may be intended to increase the addictive quality of their platforms.
Right. So I would love to see something like that. Like you mentioned, GDPR was a good first step. It has lots of flaws, but it's a good first step. CCPA made it a little bit better, but it's only in one state. So I really think that we need to have not just privacy regulation, but we need a whole suite of regulations to really sit there and figure out how to attack this problem. This is not a silver bullet problem. This is a 1,000 bullet problem.
And don't equate class regulations and micromanagement rules. Regulations can be as simple as expectations for the industry. And that's probably the best kind of light touch regulation, where you're not telling them how to do it, but clearly we expect you to anticipate harmful use of your platforms and to use things like the attack framework to, in that anticipation, then take steps to allow your customers or the victims from your platforms to engage with you to impact the kill chain.
The other thing I'll say is make sure that we take a look at this from a global perspective. And what I mean by that is if we come down very hard and write bad regulations saying, hey, disinformation isn't allowed, and let's say we're tremendously successful, how do we then take more authoritarian governments like China and Iran, how do we keep them from applying that same standard to quiet dissidents, right? We want dissidents to be able to speak out in places like Iran and China. But if we write the regulations wrong, those governments are going to use the model that we set out to quiet dissidents, and they're going to go, well, listen, we're just following your model. So it really needs to be a well thought out experiment.
Yeah, and if we don't do it at all, then like with GDPR, the EU will define this space for us, because our companies are global companies and they expect to operate and sell into all around the world and sell to European citizens, and therefore have to pool their products, their services for that market. So under regulation just invites others to regulate for us in the information economy.
And Zach asked the $1 million question. You know, the big question is who gets to decide what's disinformation?
Yeah.
Right. So what I will tell you is, you know, we talked about Chat GPT and AI a minute ago for deepfakes. I'm starting to hear a lot of talk about, well, we can use AI to detect disinformation. And what I will tell you is that AI is not good at detecting satire or editorials, right? So those are just two simple examples of which it would just fail horribly. And anybody that watches late night TV knows that we like our satire and our editorials. So it's really a very difficult problem to address.
So we are at and past the end of our hour, and this has been a fascinating discussion. And some will have to go. I'll stay on, and I don't know, Dr. Breuer, if you could stay on for a couple more minutes to take any other questions. But for those that have to go, thank you so much for participating, Dr. Breuer. Thank you for the time that you spent with us tonight. This is such an important area, and we're just beginning to understand it. Like you said, you know, we're at 2003 cyber appreciation levels with this disinformation, misinformation area. And it's exciting to contemplate the window that you've given us into, well, how might we address this structurally in a better way to rationalize risk reduction?
I'm happy to hang out, and thank you very much for having me. I will put my email in the chat. If you have questions at any point later on, I'm always happy to get questions.
Great.